spent over 20 years working with some of Salford's most vulnerable people, and I have never, in all this time, witnessed poverty at the levels we are seeing today. The government has created a hostile environment, affecting anyone who's unfortunate enough to be poor. People are suffering, lives are being put at risk. Austerity is a cruel political choice which has devastated the lives of many. I have clients who are surviving on charity food supplies for months on end. Disabled people are having their income slashed after inappropriate assessments by private companies, making a profit out of people's misery. Families are waiting several weeks to receive benefits, forcing them to choose between feeding and clothing their children and paying the rent.
If you read the media, you'd think that the increase in the cost of living was something that just happened. Out of nobody's control, it just happened. It's one of those facts of life, but it's not true. What caused the increase in the cost of living that we're facing now? It's not the war in Ukraine. It is, in fact, profiteering by corporations. The biggest single element is the increase in the cost of oil, gas and electricity. This year, before Ukraine, the cartel that run oil and gas across the entire world put up the prices of those commodities. And that is basically what has caused this massive increase in the cost of living that we're facing now. And why did they put up the price? It isn't because the cost of drilling or exploration or transport or storage or refining of gas and oil costs more. It's simply that they wanted a bigger share of the profits. They wanted to increase profits. These are corporations which make every year billions and billions and billions of pounds in profit. And the effect is predictable. A massive transfer of wealth and income from wages to profits, from workers to investors, from the poor to the rich, from labour to capital.
In the past, I gained so much satisfaction from my work, and I got a huge sense of achievement, being able to make a small difference to a lot of people. But then things began to change. The Tory government's legal aid changes, which formally came into force in April 2013, took areas of law such as welfare rights, debt and housing out of scope for legal aid. Many advice centres closed or were forced to offer reduced services. National Housing Charity Shelter had to close 9 advice centres around the country. The Social Fund also came under attack, and emergency payments to claimants were stopped. And this was replaced with a very limited resource given to local authorities to administer in order to provide emergency immediate assistance.
Governor of the Bank of England a couple of months ago told workers to moderate their wage claims. What a cheat. This was an insult to the workers of this country. Most workers in Britain have no way of increasing their wages. The anti-trade union legislation of the last 40 years has shattered the collective power to increase wages. Let me tell you, in the 1970s that Paul mentioned, 85% of British workers had their terms and conditions negotiated by a trade union. It's what they call collective bargaining coverage. Only 1 in 4 workers in Britain has the benefit of a collective agreement. That means the other 3 out of every 4 workers is at the complete mercy of the labour market, the generosity of employers. All terms and conditions now are offered on a take it or leave it basis. This is the so-called labour market, in which workers are simply commodities. Now, most of the collective bargaining coverage that's left is in the public sector, but we know what's happened to wages in the public sector. I was just reading from the ONS, the Office of National Statistics, on the train on the way up here. In the public sector, wages over the last 3 months have increased by 6.4%. In the public sector, they've increased by 1.9%. Wages, the real value of wages is falling everywhere, but in the public sector, they're falling faster than anywhere else. Of course, it's true that in some industries, some trades, wages have increased. The wages for heavy goods vehicle drivers are in the hospitality section, but here you're talking about hundreds of thousands of workers, whereas in this country we've got 32 million workers. That most of those people are going to see the value of their wages fall at a time when the things that they need to buy, heating, food, rent, are increasing. So, comrades, what's needed? What's needed is 3 things. First of all, we've got to support and join our unions. Secondly, we've got to vote out this rotten government. And thirdly, we've got to hold Labour to its commitment to change our workplace laws, which are set out in what's so-called green paper. It's actually red in colour, called A New Deal for Working People. We have to hold the Labour Party to that. It's an ambitious programme to change almost every aspect of workplace law. And if you want to know why that is necessary, just look at the P&O saga a month ago.
Disability living allowance was replaced with a much harder to qualify for personal independence payment, which has resulted in the removal of benefits from hundreds of disabled people in Salford. This has resulted in many losing their mobility vehicles and even their entitlement to have a carer under the carers allowance rules. Then universal credit was introduced to replace all working age benefits. This has undoubtedly forced many more families into poverty with its 5-week waiting period, strict evidence requirements, sanction regime and recoverable overpayments even for cases caused by official error. With soaring fuel and food prices, rising inflation rates, inflated housing costs, stagnating wages and below inflation benefit increases, I'm afraid that we're currently on a cliff edge, just waiting to be tipped over. People are coming to me for support, many of whom are in work, and there is a real sense of despair when I have to tell them that there is no more financial help available. Many of our food banks are running low on supplies and they're reliant on donations from people that are in a more stable financial position. In fact, some of our food banks are facing bankruptcy. Benefit rates have consistently failed to keep up with inflation. Currently, if a person's single, has no children and is not disabled or caring, the government has determined that £334.91 or £265.31 if they're under 25 is sufficient to meet their needs for a month. Is it any wonder that people are struggling? I hear of parents telling their children that they've already eaten or that they will eat later, when the reality is this is an excuse for them eating their children's leftovers. I had a mother tell me recently that she had £10 to her name. She could either put petrol in the car so she could go to work, or she could give her children bus fares and dinner monies, but she couldn't do both. To make matters worse, people who are in poverty or are struggling financially are often made to feel that they are somehow responsible for their own circumstances, that they don't work hard enough, they're not smart or talented enough, or that they are poor because they are not financially literate. I don't accept this for 1 minute. As we go to the ballot box this week, we need to send a clear message to this government. Salford, as the rest of the country, has had enough.
I don't have to validate the reason for the campaign, because in 2016 the Supreme Court said that everything up to that point that I'd been campaigning about was right, that the law joint enterprise had taken a wrong turn in 1984 and that there'd been 32 years of injustice. Now, with that 32 years of injustice, lots of people went to prison for murders that they didn't commit, and the courts acknowledge that. Now, as a campaign group, I'm still fighting for those people who have had convictions under the wrong law, who are still serving life sentences for the crime committed by another person. So the fight now for us is to change the law. The law is still in place and people are still being convicted. I go to the courts in Manchester and I'm watching 10 people in the dock for one crime committed by one person. If that's a murder trial and all 10 are found guilty of one murder, all of them go to prison for life, and that can't be right. You know, we're living in the 21st century here. We don't put people in prison for murder if they haven't committed murder. And most of you will think that murder means with intent. If you don't have intent, then it isn't murder. So if your friend or someone that you know commits a murder and you're sat down outside, like say for instance in a pub, you're in the pub, your friend has a fight and someone dies, does that mean every single one of your friends who you were drinking in the pub with that day has to go to prison for murder? Because you don't have the intent if you're stood at the bar buying a drink and you're not involved in that. And like I said, the Supreme Court acknowledged that in 2016. And the campaign thought, this is it, the law will change, this won't happen to anyone ever again, and all of those people that have been convicted using the wrong law will at least, in the very least, have their convictions re-looked at and be given another sentence for whatever crime they committed. For instance, if it was violent disorder, whatever it was, and if it was for nothing, that they would have the convictions quashed and they'd be released. But none of that has happened. One person, just one person in 32 years, the actual courts believe that they'd only got it wrong once with one person, and that is an absolute joke. So the campaign is now fighting to have the truth told, because it's been acknowledged, but to have the truth told in such a way that those innocent people get their lives back. We have people who are serving 25 to 30 years. Imagine if you was that person and you actually knew that the law was wrong that convicted you, and you went back to the Court of Appeal and the Court of Appeal said, well, that was a matter for the jury. Now, the jury didn't know in their cases that the law had taken a wrong turn, so it isn't a matter for the jury, it's a matter for the courts, and that's what our fight is right now. And on the 16th of May this year, we're going to be lobbying MPs in the House of Commons, and we've got a room, the Atlas Suite, and we're going to be talking about a private members bill that one of our members has actually written. One of the young women that is part of the campaign has written a private members bill with the help of quite a few QCs and academics, and it's a really powerful piece of legislation that needs to go through, and we need all the support we can get from the MPs, because without MP support we're exactly where we were back in 1984, living the wrong interpretation of the law and allowing innocent people to stay in prison. So all I'm asking you today to do is to write to your MP. Don't ask them to be there. Demand that they are there. Demand that they come and see this private members bill. Demand that they at least listen to the campaign so that they can support us if they agree with it. We've got food, nibbles and wine if that's going to entice them into the building, all paid for by the campaign. We just need them in the building, and we need your support to get those people into the building. Because otherwise, I mean, we're talking about a cost of living crisis, and at the moment we're spending billions of pounds worth of your money every year to keep innocent people in prison. We're spending millions of pounds on trials. At the moment there's trials going on in Manchester with 10 defendants in cases where only one of them is guilty, and those trials are costing about between £3 and £5 million. £3 and £5 million that could be going to the people of Manchester, the people of Salford, helping people to eat, but instead it's being used to put people in prison, and then they'll spend even more millions to keep them there, because politicians in this country like tough on crime rhetorics. They're not tough on crime, they're tough on innocent people who haven't committed crime, and what they should be saying is we should be tough on criminals, not innocent people. So hopefully you'll support the campaign. We've got a website, it's www.jointenterprise.co. Log on to it. We've got a petition begging the MPs to support what we're saying. Most of the MPs that we've spoken to already say they support us, acknowledge that it's wrong, and even some of the MPs say reform or abolish joint enterprise, and that's something that the campaign insists on as well. And I think everyone here, if you don't think you can be affected by this, then you're walking around with your eyes closed, because in 2007 I had no idea what joint enterprise was until my son, who was blind, was arrested for a murder that he not only didn't take part in or didn't even know was happening, he didn't even see it, and he was given a 12-year life sentence at the age of 15. I tried so hard to get my son out of prison, and it hadn't worked. It didn't work. He served his full sentence and then he's been released, but he's got the rest of his life on licence, 99 years on licence for a murder he didn't even see, let alone commit. So if you think I'm talking rubbish, then explain to me how a blind person who doesn't touch the victim can be guilty of that person's murder. Thank you.
If we go back to the 16th of March, we got wind that all the P&O vessels would be detained in the various ports to await a company announcement. And that announcement on the 17th of March was around the People Director, Andrew Good, who decided that it was appropriate to sack an entire workforce, 786 maritime professionals, on a Zoom call. What a disgrace. What a disgrace that this employer, P&O Ferries, thinks its pockets are deep enough and its bank account is deep enough that it doesn't even think it's got any obligations whatsoever to consult with the recognised trade unions, RMT, or the other union, Nautilus. Absolutely shameful. And that's the problem we've got, where the law in this country has been weakened over decades, such that it allows a greedy capitalist employer to think it can buy off its workforce. And that employer sacked, say, 786 maritime professionals on a coordinated operation where they employed a security service called Interforce, handcraft trained, who rolled up the gangplanks and come on board the vessels to remove our seafarers who were on duty that week. Utterly disgraceful and utterly shameful. They then proceeded to put the belongings of the seafarers who were on their off week into waste bins and dump them down into the vessels, and then take them off to the ports. Again, what a total disgrace. A rotten employer whose sole motive was to increase profit. So we've got a battle ahead, and my union's held a number of demonstrations and blockades. We had a successful blockade up in Cairn Ryan last week, where we managed to stop the P&O vessel from going out fully loaded. It only went out 50% loaded, and we've got to keep that campaign up. But the reality is we need more people to get involved, and it's been spoken about. We've got attack after an attack going across, you know, our class, the working class, and we've got to come together to redouble our efforts to actually build a big movement that will be capable of blocking the Light Port of Liverpool, blocking the Port of Dover, blocking the Port of Cairn Ryan and Hull on a continuing basis. And we've got many struggles our movement has ahead. So we will keep going until these gangster capitalists are kicked off those seafaring routes, until we've got our trade union recognition and our trade union collective agreements back in place, because we will never give up and allow unscrupulous employers like P&O to get away with it.
It's been a horrible few years, so it's so lovely to see everybody coming together on this May Day parade. But one of the things that's got me through the last 2 years has been the solidarity that I've seen in Salford, the solidarity from our amazing Salford Trades Council, our brilliant Labour councillors who are here today, and of course people across Salford. Because, you know, We were one of the first areas in the country when that first lockdown happened, when we hadn't got any money from government, to come together and think, well, you know what we do in Salford? If the government won't help us, we help our people ourselves. And that's what we did when we set up that Spirit of Salford network. Then later, when we came out of lockdown and we started to see the terrible way that some of our bosses were treating our workers, whether it was Go North West and the way that bus drivers were being fired and rehired, whether it was the check workers at Trafford Park who were simply demanding a decent pay rise. You were there. You were on those picket lines when it was cold, when it was rainy. You were showing that solidarity, that much needed solidarity. And that's why today's parade is probably more poignant than any parade we've had so far, because things are about to get really, really difficult for people across Salford. And they're going to need that solidarity. They're going to need to know that they've got somebody fighting for them. Because you've got the energy crisis. Many people's bills are going up by 50%. And the Tories' answer to this, not to try and help them, is to offer them a £200 loan that they're going to have to pay back eventually. Now, if you've got no money to pay your energy bills, how are you going to pay back a loan in the long term? We've got a housing crisis, thousands of people all across Salford waiting to try and find a home to call their own. And the Tories' answer is not to build more council houses, which is what we desperately need here in Salford. I read this morning that Boris Johnson's bringing back Right to Buy. So even the council houses that we have got are all going to be sold off. So we'll have very few left to help the people that really need that help. You've got a humanitarian crisis internationally, people fleeing some of the worst situations across the world. And instead of showing them decency, compassion and understanding, what's the government doing? Sending them to Rwanda. Absolutely disgraceful. And then finally, we've got the poverty crisis, the cost of living crisis that all of our speakers, I think, have spoken about today. People are really going to start to struggle. Inflation is going to reach skyrocketing rates over the coming months. And the government's answer to this wasn't to increase benefits in line with that rate of inflation. It was to increase them by a paltry 3%, which is actually a cut. So people in Salford have had their benefits cut at a time when they're going to be in extreme financial crisis. But the positive news, before we all just run off into the hills crying, all I ever do is depress people on May Day. We do have some hope, because the Labour movement has got the answer to all of these crises, and we have got to fight for them. On energy, we can't be ashamed or afraid of saying that the answer to the energy crisis is bringing our energy system into public ownership. And we've got to do the same for rail, mail, water and of course broadband. And the reasons for that are not just because it disperses wealth, but it gives us the opportunity to control those vital utilities, to tackle things like the climate crisis, to create jobs and to bring people's bills down, so that the emphasis isn't on shareholders and dividend extraction, it's on what we need as people to survive and to have decent lives. On the housing crisis, the movement's not had the answer to that for decades. We just need to build more council houses. It's not difficult. On humanitarian issues, again, treat people with decency, and instead of sending people to other places across the world, why not work with other countries across the world to foster peace and understanding, and have a look at who we're actually selling our arms to, because we should not be funding regimes that are displacing people and causing misery for people across the world. And then on the poverty crisis, we need a real living wage of at least £15 an hour. We need to make sure that people are treated with dignity and respect at work. And that means, yes, holding the government to account on what they've said so far in terms of work, but honestly, it means fighting for rights for every single worker from day one. It means reversing anti-trade union legislation so that we can represent workers in their workplace. And it means making sure that people actually have the health and safety rights and enforcement that they deserve by properly funding our health and safety executive and all the ancillary organisations that keep people safe at work. Now, the point of me talking about all of that, I'm going to shut up in a minute, I promise, and you can have some exciting music, but the point of me saying all that is that it's not politicians that have the answers. The Labour movement has the answers to all of the things that are making people struggle across Salford. And we've got to make sure that the Labour Party listens, we've got to make sure that the government listens, and I want to leave you with one final quote, because it's not politicians who transform the world, despite what we might try to tell everybody, but the Labour movement was the principal force that transformed misery and despair into hope and progress. That was Martin Luther King many decades ago, and never a truer word was said. So remember, we've got the power as a movement to change the world. We've got to be there for people in Salford. And that future that we all dream of, it is possible. I know it's hard, but it's only us coming together that's going to shape that world for people.
Above all, Salford is a proud city, proud of its history and heritage and of its people. We are a city that has demonstrated time and again that we're prepared to stand and fight, as in Bexley Square, and as in the ongoing struggles for equality and for a decent standard of living. So I'm proud to have spent 20 years on the front line in Salford. I'm proud to be a Salfordian, and I'm proud to be working class. Thank you.